Hello and welcome to video 2 of the Samurai versus Hoplite or Samurai versus Spartan comparison video. If you didn't catch the first one, that was a video where we just sort of compared the armoring process and the armor of these two warriors, which again are separated by almost dead on 2,000 years for our configurations. And something else that we wanted to talk about, which we think is really interesting, is the actual societal roles that these two warriors embody. In this case, a Spartiate, a Homoioi Spartan, and someone of the samurai class. And again, these are separated by continents, they are separated by 2,000 years of history, yet there are actually some really interesting similarities that we thought could be cool to point out, as again, this comparison is rarely ever made in pop culture or in the history world in general. So I guess we'll do a little bit of a rundown, just a quick summary of what we are. So I'll start first with the Spartan. Very difficult to talk about it because what is Sparta and when is Sparta? Of course, Sparta changes a lot. We're talking about a culture that spans hundreds of years, and we often like to categorize it under one term. So we undergo a lot of change, but fundamentally I am the elite aristocratic member of my city-state. I am born to two Homoioi parents, mother and father. I would have gone through a state-issued education system from roughly the age of 7, would have entered the military at around age of 18, or at least eligible to serve in military service. I am still a citizen soldier. I'm not a professional. Many people still think that the Spartans were a professional force. They didn't really have a profession. They managed plots of land that our servants or slaves, depending on your terminology, worked on. Typically, our wives managed our households, and we were very leisure-class citizens. We hunted a lot. Hunting was a massively important thing in our culture. We exercised together. We dined together. The Spartans seem to have been the most elite hoplite fighting force for a decently long period of time. Not massively, we weren't necessarily trained professionally. We seem to have been slightly more structured in terms of our military structure, and able to execute more advanced maneuvering. That's basically it. That's what gives us our edge for, again, a decently long amount of time in hoplite warfare. Once you start to change that tactic up on us, once you start to see the battles of Pylos and you start to see Leucatra, where the classical phalanx is switched up on the Spartans, we start to struggle. But fundamentally, I am an aristocratic elite in my society. I have voting power. I can run for office. I am very rich, but one thing that's interesting with the Spartans is that they were very austere, and the Homoioi literally means the similars or the equals. And even though there were some wealth disparities in our group, especially as Sparta started to go on the decline, you started to see their cultural makeup come a little bit separated from what its core was. But we had to dress, even though we were very rich, so in some cases arguably some of the richest people in Greece for a time, we didn't necessarily dress as such. We weren't flexing our wealth very much. And we have some sources that state that they had to have worn undyed clothes in Sparta, for example. Invariably, their battle dress was their main flex. We would have seen sometimes fully armored guys, of course. But that's fundamentally what I am. I am an aristocratic elite of my society. I am somewhat more militarized. I'm essentially a leisure-class citizen who has a more structured militarized foundation. So, as a samurai, that is also, I believe, a social class. But talk a little bit about that. How do you become a samurai? What are your civic duties? And are you a professional soldier?
Essentially, I guess I'll start with giving a brief history of how the samurai developed. They always served lords, the sort of aristocracy of Japan, of earlier Japanese history. They start to gain prominence when Japan begins waging a lot of wars against some indigenous peoples in northern Honshu, the Emishi, and further up north, the Ainu of Hokkaido. And they begin, this warrior caste sort of forms and begins to gain prominence. And eventually, some of the members of this warrior caste, with their own clans, start to gain high positions. Some of them start to intermarry with the imperial family. They start getting set up in court positions. They had held prominent spots in the capital of Kyoto, and eventually there's never this sort of full-on coup, but they sort of maneuver themselves into becoming the sort of ruling elite of Japan, of across the Japanese Isles. And so starting in the Heian period is when the samurai are originally wearing much bulkier armor than I am right now, oyoroi. They're mounted bowmen. This was the primary way of fighting for the samurai. And you will then, through the Warring States period, the samurai still continuing to play that role of elite, begin fighting amongst each other, rival clans, basically tearing the country apart. And from hearing you describe the Spartans, I can already pick out a lot of similarities. So, for one, leisure hunting is one of the main leisures. It's almost got a sacred status.
Leisure class citizens,
yes.
Straight off the bat, right?
Essentially, yes. So the samurai as being the sort of austere, completely like no wealth, no leisure. Not entirely true. They are essentially they become a sort of aristocratic class while keeping their warrior status. You are born a samurai. If you are a descendant, you don't become. It's not like being knighted by a European knight. It's a class of citizen. You are born into it. Now, similarly to the Spartans, the samurai become a sort of aristocratic leisure class, essentially at the top of the hierarchy in Japan. Officially, their only profession was war, but obviously you're not constantly fighting continuously uninterrupted campaigns. So during the off times when they're not on campaign, they would engage in other stuff, calligraphy, theater, poetry, occupying their lands and making sure their taxes and all the rice that their subjects owe them. They have a sort of feudal. It's not exactly like the feudalism in Europe, but it's a similar system. There are some samurai are at the top of the land, and then they'll have other samurai vassals under them, and that's how that structure functions. But during campaign seasons, they would engage in battle. During the later period, when there is peace, then the samurai are fighting almost no wars. After Sekigahara, in the Edo period, then they really start to adopt that kind of leisurely class where there were no battles to fight. And this is also the time where a lot of the spiritual element and more artistic elements of samurai culture and also some of the myths associated with them start to develop during peacetime. It's also when we get started some of the crazier crests and ornamentation. They don't have to be as practically minded. They start going,
more ceremonial flexing in that way as opposed to combat flexing.
Yeah.
So interesting, because you elaborated that more than I did. So I guess I should go a little bit back onto the foundation of the homoioi. We don't entirely know. It seems to be that Sparta was first founded by a Doric, basically invasion of the Peloponnese, where we subjected our surrounding peoples. And that's sort of what instituted us as the upper class, where we ruled over lesser populations. Were they slaves? Arguable. I usually just use the term helot, because they are sort of their own individual description. We are also, in the sense, leisure class citizens when we go through the agoge, which is a later term, but the Spartan education, no mention of military training is used at all. It seems to be sport. We see boxing, javelin, things like that, running. But otherwise, we're taught about communal dance, which of course is why is that? But dance and combat, you've heard that term, battle is like a dance. There are a lot of crossovers. It's being in sync with people. It's knowing timing. It's a lot of it's building stamina. Dance and fighting are very tiresome exercises. Things like reading and writing were a thing that Spartans would often learn from home. But we see that sort of leisure class, these people were educated, they were elites, they were incredibly wealthy, and they did things that allowed them to be more military focused as opposed to other people who were farmers or blacksmiths or whatever. So interesting in that regard, that we sort of rise to power through some form of not necessarily conquest, but similar thing. Don't necessarily start out as the ruling elite and eventually become the ruling elite. In my case, through a city-state that we founded and then conquered everyone else. And we fight with similar weapons for most of our history. The spear.
Yes.
And this is something where lots of people, and especially with the samurai and the katana, which is such a weirdly fantasized weapon.
Yeah.
Which actually comes in towards the end of the samurai period, or not towards the end, but
the katana is introduced more closer to I believe the late 1300s, closer to really the 1400s. Before that, they had the tachi, a longer, more curved sword, but mainly they were again mounted bowmen. It was the bow the way of the bow was the main samurai fighting technique.
And this is something that I think we were talking about earlier, which sort of sparked this, was the idea of honor. We have today this very interesting idea of ancient warriors and samurai being incredibly honorable warriors. The Spartans are very honorable, the samurai are very honorable. And yes, in a way, but also what they deemed as honor was different to what we deem as honor. And so we see this, the samurai fighting with bows and even guns, but that seems dishonorable, but it isn't to the samurai.
No.
That is their main style of warfare. Or when they're fighting on foot, they don't typically go to the sword, they go to the spear. And the same way that I am predominantly a spearman, right? That is my main goal. But we have this idea of honor, right? Samurai wouldn't do this, samurai fought honorably. But really, when you start to look into it, no, that wasn't really what it was like. So what was samurai honor really like in this period?
The thing that brings you most honor is winning a battle. And they will win it however way they have. Now, there are cases where, of course, maybe something was conducted in a particularly honorable way, and the Japanese themselves certainly like to emphasize that segment of their history more and go, this is an example of how to behave. This is the true way of the samurai. If you saw the way they behave in battle and during their conquests, not too dissimilar to, Vikings, knights, medieval era, they could be extremely brutal, treacherous at times. And of course, like you mentioned, they would be perfectly fine with blasting each other from a distance with firearms, or raining arrows down on each other. If it meant winning a battle, that brings honor, that brings glory. So that in and of itself, there's some examples, some brutal examples of samurai combat. Even my clan, the Oda clan, engaged in fighting against warrior monks and just absolutely mercilessly decimating them once they take their monasteries and the surrounding civilians. So in that regard, no, they were still capable of absolute brutality. There was even a practice that was cracked down on quite heavily by the Tokugawa shogunate in the Edo period, but you'd have a lot of bored samurai with no wars to fight. It wasn't unheard of a samurai walking past a peasant on the street and deciding, haven't gotten to test my sword in a while. That did happen.
Which sounds kind of insane. And as a Spartan, we often get credited as culling helots, which is a very, very complex topic. And in short, it again comes down to the when. When in Spartan history does that happen? And Plutarch specifically mentions this. He's our main source of this culling of the helots. And he literally says that he believes it was a result of, there's a catastrophic earthquake, I forget the exact date, but around either the 430s or 420s BC in Sparta, in and around there, that sparked helot revolts. And that seems to be a dramatic change in the treatment of helots, where the Krepteia might now go out and spy on aspiring helots and kill them in the night. Or the Gerusia, when they get elected, might annually declare war on them. But early on in Sparta, this doesn't seem to be the case. But in your case, it just full-on seems to be, I just want to kill you, so I'm going to. Which is a really interesting thing that you would not at all think of a samurai doing.
Yes.
The Spartans often get really unfairly credited as militaristic slave owners who are too fearful of their own slave revolts. And again, this is far too in-depth of a topic to get into in this video. We will do a separate video on this topic later. Mm-hmm. But that is such an unfair classification of what their society is. And again, you're oversimplifying a part of Spartan history to all of Spartan history. But we have another instance of Spartans typically didn't use bows or slings, whatever. We do use thrown javelins. And we know that, of course, when they're surrounded on Spacteria, they say, stop using your peltas against us, fight us like men, fight us like hoplites, which the Athenians very happily decline and will keep throwing stones at us. But we also have cases where Spartans do seemingly very dishonorable things in battle. Some of them are incredibly intelligent. We have a campaign where basically the Spartans, and I believe it's the Argives, and the Argives are copying the commands of the Spartan camp. So when the Spartans say, go for breakfast, the Argives also go for breakfast. When the Spartans say, go to bed, the Argives also go to bed. And the Spartan commanders notice this, and they go, well, we can use this to our advantage. So the king tells all of his generals to basically say that the command for, I believe it's go and feast, is actually the command for go and armor up, and we're going to attack the Argives. The Argives hear that command, they go and eat, and then the fully armored Spartan army comes and beats them. Incredibly intelligent, strategical move, but a very dishonorable win in that sense. You didn't fight them on even ground. You switched up your tactics and did something strategically very smart. We also have a case of basically a Spartan enemy army fleeing to a religious zone, where the Spartan king then, the same Spartan king, then offered free passage to all the to all of the Argive. Again, I believe it was Argives. I think it was the same campaign. I'm not entirely sure. Free passage, and they killed all of them as they came out of the religious zone. So we see that type of thing that like seems incredibly dishonorable, but that happened. Now, we also see cases of honor, and we see Spartans that feel ashamed for behaving certain ways and killing themselves, and we see stuff like that. But again, this whole idea that there were these strict chivalric codes that every single person at all times held themselves to in warrior-ish societies just is not correct at all. The same way that we even see modern militaries, right? We see in the World War and stuff like that, we have actual international war crimes, and countries still disobey them.
Yeah, of course.
So
yes.
we see similar, it's human behavior. We see that treachery existing all throughout military actions across all ages. We have this idea of honor, and it doesn't always get held up by the people that are actually fighting.
Yeah, and I will say before some people think, well, you think the samurai are evil or whatever. No, they're normal for their time period. For most armies throughout history, this is not unusual.
Exactly.
To be coming from them, and it will also, like today, vary. Not every samurai will engage in as much brutality as others, and there was a lot of legal stuff added, especially during the Tokugawa era. But yeah, no, the idea of like the full, completely honorable, honor-bound, would never take advantage of a certain advantage or to be deceitful against the enemy or whatsoever, and fully humble. Honestly, if you were to meet a samurai, they may come across as quite arrogant to you and very proud.
And of course, again, we, as modern people, our moralities change, our cultures change, our societal norms change, and someone who is a morally good person in your period, in my period, might not be a morally good person today. But we can't necessarily judge them for that because our morality is different. What our society has raised us as good and as bad is different to what that person was raised as. So we might say owning slaves is barbaric. There are still cultures today that own slaves. And that by no means defends the treatment of slaves or the action of having them, but it is someone who was raised in a time period where everyone had slaves, for instance in ancient Greece, doesn't necessarily deem it as a moral wrong to use them, because it's just a societally available tool, essentially. And again, the Spartans often get the short end of the stick of slaves, and somehow Athens gets away with it, when in reality, Athens had a slave trade that stretched across oceans. They invariably culled, castrated slaves to stop them from reproducing. They were sometimes worked to death. That somehow gets overshadowed by Sparta's slave status, which also did a lot of bad things. But again, we have this sort of modern obsession with judging historical people for doing things because we think that that's awful. How could someone do that? But that's not necessarily the same societal game that those people were raised with the rules of. So it's difficult for us.
Interesting. I have a question for you. I think it'd be an interesting chance to learn something. If a Spartan citizen felt slighted by a perioikoi or a helot, did they reserve right to punish them in any way or strike out at them? Or what was the procedure for that?
Perioikoi, I don't believe there is any. They are free peoples. They don't have voting powers. I believe helots, you could probably do whatever you wanted to, or even if it was illegal, no one would really bat an eye if you did something to them.
That's interesting. So the samurai, there was, again, the practice changes and the rules change over time, because I think the samurai were around for such a long time. I mean, till the 19th century. There was like steam engines and whatnot by the time the samurai were still around. The class wasn't fully abolished until around the time of the American Civil War, but there was a practice. Technically, a samurai at certain periods of Japanese history reserved the right to actually kill somebody under them if they felt they had been slighted. Some rules were added that they needed a witness to prove that the underclass person had actually slighted them. Again, the Tokugawa trying to, once they've established their full shogunate, they're kind of trying to rein in all of this. And it's also when, under the Tokugawa, that a lot of those, the Bushido code and that whole sense of honor starts to gain its prominence in samurai culture, and where a lot of media about samurai is based off of. But it's actually, some of that full honor stuff is coming from a period where the ruling body is trying to rein people in.
Right.
Like, okay, stop
abusing
yeah,
your
they're trying to centralize a bit more.
That's cool.
And yeah.
So there we go, a little bit of an interesting comparison. Again, some similarities, some none. I think something else to consider is we just have sort of more in-depth sources about you, right? A lot of our stuff is really shaky. Yeah. I also haven't fully revised myself on the whole headlock practice. For instance, would it be illegal or not to punish them? But a little bit of food for thought there. How do aristocratic members of society change, and how do they remain similar across sort of militarized social classes to an extent, but across cultures and across time periods? So thanks very much for watching. Thanks again, Max, for your time here today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
We'll hopefully catch you guys in the next video. A special thanks to the channel members and Patreons who continue to support the channel. Truly does mean a lot. And yeah, we'll see you later.